So let's give a minute for a few more people to get on. Good morning. Thank you to everyone who's joined. It's time to begin. This is Luke Forster at NYSERDA. You are attending the Distributed Solar Roadmap first overview webinar. Next slide, please. Just a few notes and housekeeping items before we begin the webinar in earnest. We are recording the webinar. I know that's the #1 question we receive. I've already received that question today. Yes, it will be recorded, and the recording and the slide deck will be posted to the New York Sun Contractor Resources website, typically a few days after the webinar occurs. Everyone has been muted. I know we have about 480 people registered for the WebEx today. We've got about 250 on the line so far, with more joining. So everyone will be muted, and we will be doing Q&A through the Q&A chat box in your WebEx window. So if you have a question at any point, please type it in the box and hit send. We will not be doing Q&A on a rolling basis. Rather, we're going to hold all the questions till the end, and we'll go through them all together. But please don't be shy about any questions you have. Next slide, please. Here's the agenda for the day. By means of introduction, I'm Luke Forster. I'm a senior business analyst at NYSERDA's New York Sun and Distributed Energy Resources team. I've been on the solar team at NYSERDA for about 9 years. I was involved in the development of the Distributed Solar Roadmap. I'll be the primary presenter today, but that's not to say that I'm alone here. We have a great team of NYSERDA and DPS staff on the line as well. From the New York Sun side, we have our Vice President of Distributed Energy Resources, David Sandbank, and our new Assistant Director, Shia Mehta, and others, including my colleagues Chris Rogers, Sarah Gianthi, Dylan Cunningham. They will all be on standby to help with Q&A at the end of the call. Additionally, we have numerous colleagues from DPS, Department of Public Service. We have Marco Padula, Lauren Myers, Justin Fung, John Garvey, and potentially others on as well. So the benches are full, and we are well prepared to talk about this roadmap and any questions you may have. So thank you to all my colleagues for joining and lending their support today. So first, we'll talk a little bit about the context around the state of New York's distributed solar industry, and what happened in the need to develop the distributed solar roadmap. Then we'll do a deep dive into the content of the roadmap document itself, talking about both the incentive design that it proposes, as well as other recommendations, not least of which relates to disadvantaged communities and LMI households. Finally, we have ample time blocked out for questions and answers at the end. The webinar is going to run until noon, so I anticipate at least 40 minutes or so for Q&A. Next slide, please. And I want to talk a little bit about how we're doing this webinar series. So you probably saw the announcement. We're doing 2 webinars. We're currently on the first one, the matinee, which is today, and we will have a repeat performance on Thursday afternoon, 2 days from now. Both presentations are going to essentially feature the same slide deck. Today's presentation will be doing a deeper dive into issues that are of interest to solar developers, financiers, and installers. We'll be spending a little bit more time on the roadmap's recommendations regarding incentive rates and potential megawatt block design. And the Thursday presentation is geared a little bit more towards other stakeholders, and it will have an expanded discussion and a few extra slides about the solar energy equity framework, disadvantaged communities, LMI households. In that webinar is intended a bit more towards advocacy groups, housing authorities, and others working in that sphere. You're certainly welcome to attend both, but I want to give that context that the discussion will be a little bit different on each of those 2 calls. We felt like those 2 groups of stakeholders were distinct enough with different interests that we wanted to break that discussion out to allow for full Q&A time in each of those 2 spheres. Again, the webinars will be recorded and they'll be posted on New York Sun's Resources for Contractors page. Please give us 2 or 3 days to get that recording kind of processed and uploaded. It takes a little bit of time to go through that IT process and get that up on the web. But I assure you it is being recorded and will be posted. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about this thing called the Distributed Solar Roadmap. Next slide, please. So as many of you are aware, the last few years have seen very robust growth and development on the distributed solar industry in New York State. When I'm talking about distributed solar, I'm referring to projects 5 megawatts AC or smaller that interconnect through one of New York State's utility companies, as opposed to large-scale projects that participate directly in the NYSERDA market. New York State has had a goal, a mandate of 6 gigawatts of distributed solar to be built by the year 2025. We are well on the path to achieving that. Nearly 95% of that 6 gigawatt target is either built and in the ground. We've got about 3.2 gigawatts at this point that are already interconnected, or in an advanced stage of development. By advanced stage of development, I mean they've gone through their utility interconnection study, they've made a down payment towards that, they've secured permits from planning and zoning boards, and they've reserved New York Sun incentives. So it's a very, very safe bet at this point that we will hit that 6 gigawatt target, not just on time, but early. A lot of great things have happened over the past 2 decades as well. The average price per watt for solar has dropped, not just due to module costs dropping, but due to soft cost reductions, due to the scaling up of the market, due to the growth of sort of a holistic ecosphere of installers, developers, customer acquisition companies, financiers, etc. And as those costs have dropped, New York State incentives have dropped as well. Not just the NYSERDA incentive, but also utility tools such as the market transition credit and community credit for community solar. Those have stepped down over time as well. The market's really taken off, and the latest numbers we have show that there are about 12,000 solar jobs in New York State. So while we've seen that enormous growth, most existing incentives have been fully tapped out. The New York Sun Megawatt Block Program, especially in the commercial industrial sphere, has been fully allocated as of early in 2021. Community credit for community solar projects has been fully allocated in each of the utilities, and the community adder has been used up as well. So the big question that's happened over the past year is essentially what's next? What's next for the industry? What's next for New York State's distributed solar policy? So with that in mind, NYSERDA and DPS, Department of Public Service staff, have worked together to develop a document, a petition, a white paper called the Distributed Solar Roadmap, which proposes a recommended pathway to achieve 6 gigawatts of 10 gigawatts of distributed solar by 2030. This would essentially bump up the existing goal of 6 gigawatts by 2025 to 10 gigawatts by 2030, adding an incremental 4 gigawatts. Please keep in mind that this roadmap, while a pretty thoughtfully developed document, is essentially still a petition at this point, which is going before the Public Service Commission, PSC. It's not yet set in stone or approved. So everything I'm going to talk about today, all of the recommendations, recommended incentive rates, budget numbers, are essentially that they're recommended measures that are not yet locked in. I'll talk a little bit about the timeline and how that roadmap could essentially move from, a petition to an order, but please keep that in mind as we go throughout the presentation today. That roadmap sort of took a wide look at various options out there, both in terms of how an incentive could be set to support solar, in what forms, in what measures could be taken to structure those incentives as well. Next slide, please. And before we go any further, here's just a little bit more table setting, giving you a sense of where New York's industry is today. So along the y-axis, I have listed, various segments of the market. Con Ed residential, Con Ed meaning the greater metro area of New York State, both New York City and parts of Westchester. New York Sun has separate incentive blocks for Con Ed residential, Con Ed non-residential projects, upstate residential, upstate non-residential, projects on Long Island. In the second to last bar from the bottom is the upstate commercial / industrial market segment, and that does include CDG. That's essentially all projects located upstate, greater than 750 kilowatts DC, and less than 5 megawatts AC. So that's really where we've seen the most growth and the most development over the past few years, is these 1 to 5 megawatt AC community solar projects upstate. Looking at the bars, the blue is what is already built, completed, and are connected to the grid, or above 3 megawatts at this point. And that yellow bar is what's under development at a mature stage of development, with an NYSERDA incentive locked in. And you'll see that's another 2.2 gigawatts or so. As I mentioned earlier, what's completed plus what's in that advanced stage of development is getting us pretty close to 6 gigawatts already. So the question is, if we want to get to 10 gigawatts, what is the correct structure to do so? Next slide, please. A little bit more background. This is a bar graph of how many megawatts of commercial industrial solar has been installed per year from 2014 to 2021. Please note that residential is not included on this bar graph, and the 2021 data is as of the end of November, so that does not include the big kind of lump sum of December completions we saw at the year end. But what we're seeing here is a couple of broad trends. First, we're seeing more and more megawatt scale solar installed each year. We're seeing a very large portion of it in recent years has been community solar. That's the navy blue as opposed to the light blue. We're seeing the average project cost per watt for this commercial industrial solar has dropped steadily from $2.75 a watt to $1.40 a watt. And we're seeing that the NYSERDA incentive has steadily ticked down over time from 83 cents a watt to 25 cents a watt. And that's even when we include new incentive adders like the brownfield adder, the community adder, etc. So all in all, a very positive story. Next slide, please. So many of you were there. NYSERDA and DPS jointly had a kind of 2-day technical conference webinar series last April. So that webinar, that technical conference, essentially gave a state of the industry, talking about some of the things I just covered in the last 2 slides, where the industry is, where recent deployments and development have been, recent cost trends, recent incentive trends, and it involved a good look at the benefits of distributed solar as well. That technical conference suggested that additional incentives would be needed if the 6 gigawatt goal were to be expanded. And there was a good deal of thought and discussion about how the E value, the environmental value, and the value stack could be somehow increased or adjusted to better account for the clean energy benefits of renewable generation. So that was the first day of the technical conference, was a presentation from NYSERDA and DPS. And 2 weeks after it, there was sort of a reply day where several parties, including industry representatives for the clean energy parties, presented, Borrego Solar presented, and the joint utilities presented various thoughts and various proposals on how the state should think about advancing distributed solar. The clean energy parties gave a nice presentation and stressed, among other things, the importance of a transparent and quickly implemented program change or program expansion, suggesting that incremental changes were preferable to a full policy overhaul and new program design. So that was good feedback. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So following the technical conference and all the comments that came in, NYSERDA and DPS began working together on a roadmap document to propose a path forward for the PV industry. We did a lot of research. We looked into a lot of quantitative analysis on project costs, project revenues. We looked at the ITC. We looked at all sorts of revenues, and we looked at regional project cases. We took a look at how the EPC varied by region. We looked at interconnection costs. We looked at potential trends and future costs, and we took a good thorough look at the project revenue side as well. As part of this, we developed close to 100 different use cases, community solar versus remote crediting, upstate versus downstate, larger projects versus smaller projects, and we did extensive modeling basically to calculate what the required revenue would be for a given project to pencil out, and how those project economics changed under different incentive or support scenarios. So we did some very thorough work there, and that's captured in Appendix B of the roadmap. I invite you to take a look at that if you haven't already done so. And the roadmap did examine a goal of 10 gigawatts by 2030, which was consistent with the goal that Governor Hochul announced in September 2021. Next slide, please. So the roadmap was filed on December 17th, 2021. Thank you to the industry for your patience. That was a pretty thorough development of that roadmap, and that did take a significant amount of time to polish that to build consensus and get that filed. Where we stand now is that roadmap is open for public comments through March 7th, 2022. There is a 60 business day comment period, which already began. I encourage anyone who has an opinion on this to file those comments with Department of Public Service. We've got a hyperlink in the slides. You can also do a Google search for DPS case number 21-E-0629, or you could go to the DPS master matter page and do a search for that case number. I will point out that this is a separate case from VEDR. It's a separate case from the existing New York Sun program design. So if you're used to going to the VEDR page, maybe have that bookmarked, you will not see the filing here. It's on a separate case. Again, the roadmap is essentially a petition that has been filed. So after the public comment period closes on March 7th, the Public Service Commission and DPS will review all comments that have been filed. They'll read through those and they'll consider them thoroughly. And at that point, the PSC may then issue an order approving, denying, approving with changes those items requested in the roadmap. We don't have an exact time frame on when a potential PSC ruling would come, but it would not be before March 7th. It would quite possibly be a few months after that. Again, the PSC won't necessarily approve everything in the roadmap verbatim. They do have the option of making changes or a modified version in their resulting order. If and when the PSC issues an approval of the roadmap, NYSERDA would then implement an updated program design in our implementation plan. That should be relatively quick and simple, given that we're considering an expansion of New York Sun, and that document is already built out. And then we could essentially leverage the existing New York Sun program design, including the Salesforce platform, our web pages, and all of our infrastructure that's already in place. So the implementation would be relatively quick and simple, assuming the approval. Next slide, please. I'll talk a little bit about the content in the roadmap. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the roadmap really took a wide look at many different potential program designs. Of course, it ultimately recommended an upfront incentive, through an extension of New York Sun, which is an administratively set upfront incentive. But it also took a look and we analyzed, what would it look like if there was a tariff-based per kilowatt hour incentive, either coupled with the E value or independent. We also analyzed what does it look like if the incentive is set by NYSERDA and DPS versus having an auction-based incentive similar to what NYSERDA has in the large-scale renewables program and the Tier 1 REC. We also examined and analyzed what would be the impact if the incentive was fixed, a set amount, versus an indexed product, again, like they have in Tier 1, where you would essentially receive a fixed amount of energy plus capacity plus incentive in the value stack. So we really, were thorough and examined multiple different options. Each of those options is described, and we discussed the pros and cons and difficulties and strengths and weaknesses of each in that roadmap document and in Appendix A. What we ultimately recommended was an extension of the New York Sun megawatt block incentive and basically extending that from 6 gigawatts to 2025, 10 gigawatts by 2030. A couple of reasons for doing so. The megawatt block program has a pretty good track record for transparency and flexibility. When I'm talking about transparency, I'm referring to, for instance, the real-time megawatt block dashboards we have on the website, where you can see exactly how many dollars are available at any given time, at any given incentive rate. And by flexibility, it's not overly burdensome for NYSERDA to make program tweaks and changes, either in the program design or to the program requirements in the program manual. If, for instance, market uptake is faster or slower than expected. We have a relatively high degree of ability to pivot and make program changes as needed. Additionally, a program expansion could be operationalized very soon after approval, because as I mentioned, we can just essentially piggyback on the program infrastructure that has already been built out through Salesforce, through our contractor portal, through all of our contractor resources. By contrast, if we were essentially launching an entirely new program, that would take more time to set up. I'm just looking over the slide here. The auction-based approach had a theoretical potential to result in lower incentives and a greater efficiency of spending ratepayer dollars, but there were some very significant incompatibilities between an auction-based approach and the SIR. Essentially, in the interconnection queue, projects line up in order of their applications on each given substation or feeder. And if there was an auction whereby certain projects had winning bids and others didn't, it would be very difficult for projects to essentially jump queue and move ahead or behind other projects in that queue. It would result in a lot of recalculations of Caesar studies and could be very burdensome and costly to implement. Additionally, we looked at the indexed offering. It had additional risk and complexity that didn't necessarily outweigh the perceived benefits. All this is in greater detail in the roadmap document, but I'm just mentioning these here to indicate that we did cast a wide net and look at a variety of different program designs. Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, so the roadmap also includes a few recommendations regarding interconnection policy. The first is a modification to the utility planning process. In a nutshell, the roadmap proposes that the utilities should essentially bake the 10 gigawatt goal into their utility planning processes. The inclusion and consideration of distributed system investments that expand hosting capacity in future utility capital investment plans. Again, utilities should prioritize upgrades that support the 10 gigawatt goal. And finally, the roadmap recommends an expansion of the cost sharing 2.0 framework. More content is in the roadmap. I don't want to spend too much time here. So let's move on to the next slide, please. The roadmap also considers that prevailing wage will likely be coming in some form to New York State in the near future, whether through federal policy in order to qualify for the ITC if BBB is approved. And there may also be a state prevailing wage requirement. So in the roadmap, we recommend, let's just implement a 1 megawatt AC cap for prevailing wage, meaning all new projects greater than 1 megawatt would be subject to prevailing wage requirements. We recommended a gradual phase-in particular, projects that had submitted their initial utility application prior to December 17th, following the roadmap, would not be impacted by this prevailing wage requirement. It would essentially apply only to newer projects that submit their initial utility application after that date. And in the roadmap, it's recommended that there be an incentive adder to essentially support projects through this transition. 12.5 cents per watt upstate, 20 cents per watt in Con Ed to make that a smoother transition. I expect we'll get a lot of good comments on this topic in the comments. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that 4 gigawatt goal. So you'll see a table here sort of stacking up how we get to that 4 gigawatt total. The largest piece of the pie, 2.9 gigawatts, would be from upstate megawatt scale projects, essentially an extension of the existing commercial industrial megawatt block incentive. Historically, this has been the largest market segment where we've seen deployment over the past few years. It's a very cost-effective way to install projects. In the roadmap, we also recommended a sizable carve-out for Con Edison projects, 450 megawatts DC. And we know that in Con Ed, project siting is difficult, it's costly, and it's not viable to install, many 5 megawatt projects like you can upstate. So we were very thoughtful and deliberate in breaking this into different project sizes in Con Ed. We landed on 150 megawatts of new capacity for residential projects, 150 megawatts for small projects. By small, I mean small commercial, those commercial projects under 1 megawatt DC, and finally 150 megawatts for commercial projects greater than 1 megawatt DC. I'm saying commercial, it can be, on municipal buildings, it can be on schools, it can be community solar. It's essentially a residential, non-residential split here. So if you add up those items, that gets us to about 3.39 megawatts. We anticipate that about 607 megawatts would be built outside the scope of this proposed incentive structure. We think that there would be a small amount, about 47 megawatts of residential projects built without incentives once the megawatt block winds down. Additionally, we think there would be about 560 megawatts of projects in Long Island. We've had discussions with LIPA, PSEG. They currently believe that 560 megawatts could get built by 2030 without additional incentive dollars required. So they're currently not announcing any new incentives there, but that will ultimately be something that they will discuss in the future. So that's how we get to 4 gigawatts under this proposal. Let's move to the next slide, please. And I heard a little burst of sound. Was there another presenter that wanted to speak? Okay, I will proceed. So in the roadmap, you will see that there is a total budget request of $1,474 million, also known as about $1.47 billion in New York Sun program funding to achieve this incremental 4 gigawatt target. In the roadmap document, we have this broken down by budget line item, a few different ways. But in a nutshell, about $420 million would be set aside for those upstate commercial industrial projects. About $400 million would be set aside for Con Edison projects in terms of base incentive, parking canopy, and rooftop adder. There's a typo on the slide here. Community adder is actually included in the next item in the $179 million of community adder and beneficial siting incentive adders like the brownfield adder, which would be available to both upstate and Con Edison projects. So what we're showing here is that a certain portion of the budget, a sizable portion, is for upstate, a certain sizable portion is for downstate, Con Edison, and about $179 million will support projects in both market segments. Additionally, I mentioned that there would be the prevailing wage requirements and additional incentive dollars to sort of offset and support projects through that additional requirement. That's the $239 million. In this roadmap, proposes that program costs would be essentially collected from ratepayers over a period going until 2032 until the program winds down. Next slide, please. And we've got a nice visual here, essentially showing how everything adds up to the $1.47 billion. 999 million would be all of the incentives put together. That's Upstate plus Con Ed, plus Community Adder, plus the other incentive adders. Funds to assist in the prevailing wage transition is about 240 million. The solar energy equity framework is about 207. I'll get to the SEEF in a minute. That's essentially the structure to support projects that serve disadvantaged communities and other stakeholders. We've got 16 million for New York State cost recovery fee and pretty minor amounts for administration and evaluation. Next slide, please. Ratepayer impact. I know everyone on the call, is enthusiastic about installing more solar, but it's very important to think about where this funding is coming from in the ratepayer impact. In order to collect the $1.47 billion, that's essentially collecting $71 a month from each residential customer in the state, in the investor-owned utility segment of the state for an 11-year period. The peak year of highest collections would be 2024, and that would essentially increase that residential bill by a little over 1% per month. We expect that federal ITC will help support these projects as well, and we do anticipate cost reductions as project development and installation and hardware costs drop over time. Next slide, please. I'd like to do a little bit of a deep dive in Upstate and then a little deep dive on the next slide in Con Ed. So for Upstate, we discussed that we're recommending an incentive for 2,943 megawatts of new commercial industrial scale projects. We proposed an initial block of 800 megawatts at 17 cents per watt. For those of you who've been participating in the megawatt block program for a while, you'll notice that 800 megawatts is a very large, very sizable block. Additionally, 17 cents per watt is a richer incentive than the last block that closed in the program, which was 11 cents per watt. So why are we doing this? Why are we recommending a very large block? Essentially because the block program has been closed for close to a year at this point. We know that there is a relatively large backlog of projects that have paid a 25% upgrade payments. Maybe they secured some financing, maybe they have their permitting. So we anticipate that if and when we get an order and launch the new program, we anticipate that there would be a sizable flow of projects coming in shortly after the program opens. 17 cents per watt. Yes, that is a step up from the last block of 11 cents per watt. Two thoughts regarding that. First, the ITC has been stepping down. And additionally, I'd encourage you to take a look at not just the block rate, but the block plus the community adder together as a pair. Our last community adder offering was 16 cents a watt plus 11 cents base incentive, so 27 cents a watt total. This proposed new base incentive plus community adder is 24 cents a watt total, so that is a minor step down in total compensation that community solar project would get. We've already received a few good comments about the incentive rates. I would encourage you to file any comments you have, on that DPS master matter case. Community adder, we're proposing significant budget to allocate community adder to about 70% of the new megawatts. The other 30% would be remote credited projects or potentially on-site projects as well. The prevailing wage adder of 12.5 cents per watt, we essentially sized that out based on the incremental cost of prevailing wage labor versus non-PW labor. So that's an attempt to basically do a clean wash of that additional cost. We are proposing extending the brownfield landfill adder at its current 15 cent per watt level. That could potentially be expanded to other beneficial siting, for instance, floating PV, for instance, projects co-located with active farming. So we're discussing that as well. So that's Upstate in a nutshell. Can we go to the slide that says proposed incentives for Con Ed projects? There we go. Thank you. So I talked a little bit about siting projects is much more difficult down near New York City. So as a result, we're seeing a greater importance on the development of smaller projects down there. So we're essentially breaking the proposed megawatt capacity addition into 3 parts. The first is commercial industrial projects greater than 1 megawatt DC. That would have a proposed incentive of 75 cents per watt. Smaller projects less than 1 megawatt would receive a proposed incentive of $1.30 per watt. And we're proposing residential projects adding on a new block, a residential block designed at 15 cents per watt. These are the base incentives. You could potentially receive some of the adders on top of the base incentive. For instance, community adder, 12 cents per watt. That's a few cents per watt higher in Con Ed than Upstate to reflect the higher cost of doing business there and the smaller project sizes that don't get the same economy of scale. Prevailing wage adder, and again, the landfill brownfield adder is also on the table. Additionally, not covered on the slide, there is a rooftop canopy adder and a parking canopy adder in Con Edison as well. We are proposing an extension of those as well at the current incentive rates. Why did we propose such radically different incentive rates for smaller versus larger Con Ed projects? NYSERDA took a long, thorough look at the cost per watt of projects that have been submitted to our program over the past few years, and we saw that there is a very tight correlation between project size and project EPC project development cost. And there was a pretty clean step down in cost around that 1 megawatt scale. So that's Con Ed. Let's move on to the next slide, please. This is a very important topic, and this is something that myself and all of my colleagues at NYSERDA, and I'm sure DPS, have been getting questions about. These questions revolve around, if I'm a developer and I have a project that's already at a certain state of development, am I eligible for these potential incentives? And I just have some quotes here. This is the language from the roadmap. Again, the roadmap is a petition. It's not set in stone as the final order, but this is what it says. The first quote, Upstate C&I projects that have already received an incentive from New York Sun cannot cancel and reapply to get a higher incentive rate. That quote does not specify what happens if you have a base incentive but not a community adder, or you have a brownfield incentive but not a base incentive. The wording is currently, if you have an incentive, you cannot cancel and reapply. Second quote, projects that have not previously received a New York Sun incentive may apply for the new ones, subject to program rules and availability. So if you have a project that's already paid its 25%, but you missed out on the last block, the idea is that the new proposed block would be open for you and your project. And then the last quote is about Con Ed. I'll just read this verbatim since it's pretty important and the wording is pretty precise. Con Edison non-residential projects that apply to the New York Sun program subsequent to the filing of this roadmap, as well as Con Ed non-residential projects that submitted applications to Block 10, current block, and were not previously awarded the community credit, may, subject to the authorizing commission order, opt into the new incentive structure proposed above. So essentially, if you're developing a Con Ed project, there is no penalty for you submitting to the current block, locking in the current rate, and then seeing if the higher proposed rates are approved, and then essentially upgrading your incentive. But we will not let you do that if you've already locked in a community credit, because that is frankly, a very rich incentive already. Again, this is the current wording in the roadmap. If you have comments on this, this would be a great comment to file on the DPS page. So I anticipate getting a lot of questions about the slide. So we will address those once the presentation's over and move to the QA phase. Next slide, please. I'm just going to give a quick overview of the solar energy equity framework and some of the DAC content. As I mentioned earlier, my colleague Max Joel, our team lead, will be doing a much deeper dive on this topic on Thursday's call. So the Climate Act, also known as the CLCPA, has this requirement that 40% of proposed capacity be targeted towards LMI residents, regulated affordable housing, disadvantaged communities, and environmental justice communities. We are abiding by that in the roadmap recommendations. So 40% of 4 gigawatts is, 1,600 megawatts. That would be targeted towards such off-takers and such customers. So of that 1,600 megawatts, please remember that the program design includes about 600 megawatts of projects not receiving incentives in the structure. So of the megawatts, receiving incentives in this design, 40% of that is about 1,357 megawatts. So that amount of megawatts would be targeted for new incentives through the Solar Energy Equity Framework. We have about 207 million in budget carved out dedicated towards these projects in the budget. Additionally, these DAC projects would also be eligible for their share of the base incentive. So they're not just getting the 207, they're getting a share of the base incentive. 40% of the base incentive is about 400 million. So it'd be 207 plus about 400 going towards these projects in total. In the roadmap, we propose continuing New York Sun's existing solar energy equity frameworks, and at least half of the new capacity, half of that 1357, would be targeted towards residential projects. We're also kind of designing a new program support for community-led solar projects. We'll get into that in on Thursday's call, the nice deep dive. And we are increasing coordination with other technologies and other programs, including building electrification, heat pumps, energy efficiency, and energy storage. So needless to say, a lot going on with the SEEF. Next slide, please. And here is just a quick overview of the 4 primary SEEF programs that are already in existence under New York Sun. We have the Affordable Solar Single Family Incentive. It's essentially an enriched incentives for income eligible single family households. We have the Multifamily Affordable Housing Incentive. Again, it's an enriched incentive towards qualifying households. Qualifying multifamily buildings. My colleague Chris Rogers runs the Affordable Solar and Storage Pre-Development and Technical Assistance Program. NYSERDA essentially provides grant money to support projects in planning and developing and essentially putting together projects on qualifying buildings. And finally, the newest one is the Inclusive Community Solar Adder, which is essentially an enriched community adder for projects that serve a certain portion of LMI or DAC off-takers. We propose extending these 4 programs in the design specified in the solar roadmap. So next slide, please. We're winding down on the presentation. Just a few notes about the potential benefits of increasing from 6 gigawatts to 10 gigawatts by 2030. That would pull in approximately 4.4 billion in private investments from developers, customers, financiers, federal ITC money. An additional 4 gigawatts of community solar, of distributed solar would significantly reduce New York State's greenhouse gas emissions by about 64 million tons. Bill credits or bill savings would go to about 127,000 additional New Yorkers. There could be an additional 6,000 jobs created, many of them prevailing wage, especially as the program transitions to the later years. And an incremental 4 gigawatts is enough to power about 700,000 New York homes. So next slide, please. I know I threw out an awful lot of content pretty quickly. Hopefully this isn't all new content. Everything I covered is discussed in the roadmap. So now we're going to open it up for questions and answers. And if you could go one more slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to break in a moment. My colleagues and I will work through all of the Q&A that have been submitted. You may hear some pauses as we discuss, as we go through individual questions, as we're formatting responses. So the cadence may get a little bit choppy. We're still here. We haven't ended the call. So thanks for your patience there. If you have particular questions about this presentation, you can email our community solar box. My colleagues just finished developing a really nice one-pager, a quick overview of the roadmap. That is on the New York Sun Contractor Resources page. Additionally, we will have a link to that in the slides that we post. And finally, a couple final reminders. Yes, the webinar is recorded. We will get that posted in the next few days. Please don't ask additional questions about that. And you have until March 7th, a little over a month, to file comments with DPS and the PSC on the solar roadmap. It's pretty self-explanatory. You just go to the proper case and you follow the instructions on how to file a document. So I'm going to pause my mic now, and we're going to start digging into all these questions. Thank you for listening. Okay, this is Luke again. I'm going to take a stab at a couple of these questions. I'm going to take 4 of these. And I'll invite my NYSERDA and DPS colleagues to unmute and take them as they come. First question, is the extra prevailing wage incentive adder an upfront incentive? Yes, we are proposing that all incentives and incentive adders, as proposed in the roadmap, be paid out under the same payment schedule that NYSERDA currently has for the megawatt block. And that's 50% of the incentive when the project gets permission to operate, 25% of the incentive at the end of year 1, and then 25% of the incentive at the end of year 2. So we're really proposing that all of the incentives and adders be treated the same way in that payout effect. Second question, second question is essentially, how will this prevailing wage requirement impact projects already under development? So what we're proposing is that the prevailing wage requirement would only apply to essentially new projects that haven't submit an application to the utility yet. So these are projects at a very early stage of development, and I would say at that early stage, you should essentially be able to plan for prevailing wage. It shouldn't be a surprise. For everything that's submit their initial utility application, we don't want to rock the boat on those projects and require new costs. So those projects that have already taken that first step with the utility would essentially not be impacted by that new requirement. Third question, that prevailing wage, that 1 megawatt cutoff, that is megawatts AC, not DC. I'm being a little bit tricky. I'm kind of moving between AC and DC in the presentation. Most items were DC, but that prevailing wage 1 megawatt threshold is AC, so inverter size. Another question on prevailing wage, that essentially, is that 239 million enough to serve all of the projects in the new design? I'd say yes, we were pretty conservative in sizing that out. It's designed so that we're not going to essentially run out of that money before the block closes. We should put some thought into, what will happen towards the end of that funding, but it's essentially sized to carry all the projects through the new block design. I'm going to mute myself. Shyam, Sarah, David, if you'd like to take a few questions, please jump in.
Luke, this is Sarah Jayanthi, everybody from the New York Sun team. I'll just take a quick question. So somebody asked a question about the community adder in Con Ed territory. So are projects eligible for the 10 cents a watt community adder proposed for CDG in the Con Ed territory if customers are in the opt-out program? So for the person who asked this question, feel free to provide clarity, but I believe you're probably referring to the opt-out CDG program for CCAs. So, our answer for that is to be determined with the petition that came out in November around opt-out CDG. That's kind of still in process, but we do recommend that you actually attend. There are some webinars that our community's colleagues are doing around opt-out CDG. The first one is actually happening tomorrow. So we recommend that you attend those where there's going to be more information, including some recommendations from DPS and from NYSERDA.
Luke, I'll take question 9 to just give you a break. One question is, I'd like to understand if there are any plans to provide future incentive blocks for non-residential programs upstate. There is no plan to add any incentives right now to the non-residential program upstate. Currently, there's about 127 megawatts remaining. Historically, we're seeing maybe about 20 megawatts a year of capacity uptake, so that's 6+ years of remaining capacity. So there's no plans at this point to add any remaining capacity there. If the non-residential megawatt block runs out prior to 2030, there's still a C&I program. Obviously, those projects could get incentives in the commercial industrial program if that is still open.
This is Shyam Mehta here from the NYSERDA team. Just going to take another few additional questions. The first one is a question basically about how much confidence that we have in the quote unquote advanced stage development pipeline and how likely those projects are to get built. So advanced stage in this context basically means these projects are part of the New York Sun pipeline, which means they have secured some form of New York Sun incentive, and by doing so would have had to secure their non-ministerial permits as well as have made their 25% interconnection deposit. So in other words, the project maturity requirements to be part of the New York Sun pipeline or this advanced stage pipeline are quite high, and therefore attrition in this class has historically tended to be very low. So the short answer is there's a pretty high level of confidence that a very high percentage of that advanced stage pipeline will eventually be constructed. The second question that I'll answer is why the proposed community adder as well as other incentives in this roadmap do not include Long Island or are not available to Long Island projects. So the answer here has been the case for some time is related to the fact that LIPA customers do not pay into the Clean Energy Fund, which is what has historically funded New York Sun and is proposed to continue funding these the proposed roadmap incentives. Now, having said that, LIPA does currently offer both a community credit incentive as part of the bidder value stack, as well as an additional rebate for community solar projects that are under 750 kilowatts. And so those are available. But as far as New York Sun incentives are concerned, the fact that LIPA customers do not pay into the CEF is really the key point here. The other point that's worth making, I think that Luke already touched upon, is that with regard to that 560 megawatts of target LIPA allocations towards the additional 4 gigawatt goal, to the extent that incentives will be needed to realize some portion of that 560 megawatts, that support would need to come from LIPA for the same reason I mentioned. And then the final question I'll take is with regard to the, well, a couple of questions. One is with whether the 1 megawatt threshold for the proposed prevailing wage programmatic requirements is AC or DC. So in this case, it is AC. That information will basically be determined through the interconnection applications. And then final question I'll take is one on how and where the 70% target CDG allocation for the roadmap targets fits into the adder equation for community solar. So really the only place where it relates to the 70% relates to the adder is for NYSERDA and DPS's purposes, that target ratio of CDG versus remote crediting, or CDG versus non-CDG, let's just say, that ultimately flows into our megawatt allocation needs for the community adder and therefore the requested funding levels. Beyond that, there's no real connection. So with that, I will hand things over to one of my NYSERDA colleagues to answer some additional questions. I think back to Luke, in fact.
Yeah, I'll take a couple. Just a question on our terminology. What is the difference between the non-residential megawatt block versus the C&I commercial industrial megawatt block? Just a little bit of lingo. We refer to the non-residential block. It's essentially the medium-sized projects. It's not single-family residential, and it's 750 kilowatts and smaller. By contrast, commercial industrial is 750 kilowatts and up. And then a couple more questions about prevailing wage. Essentially, how do you qualify for that prevailing wage incentive adder? That is available for projects that would be under a new prevailing wage program requirement. So, if when, the roadmap is approved and an order comes out, there would be language in some of the program documentation that says if you submitted your initial utility application after this date, and if you are 1 megawatt AC and larger, you must pay prevailing wage on the project in order to qualify for the NYSERDA incentive. If you do, you get the extra 12.5 cents per watt upstate or 20 cents per watt downstate. The way it's written now is projects under 1 megawatt would not be covered by that prevailing wage requirement. It's possible you might have a prevailing wage requirement from another venue, for instance, if you're installing on a town hall. But the roadmap is not recommending that prevailing wage adder go to those projects that are not under that requirement by being less than 1 megawatt. So kind of a complicated answer, but I think I covered it all. Chris or Andy, if that didn't answer your question, please shoot another text and I'll take another stab at it. And I will pass the mic to anyone else who's ready to take a few.
Chris, do you see questions 14 and 15? 14 and 16?
Yeah, I want to jump in really quick. So the question is about where does multifamily fall under the new proposed incentives? The answer is that multifamily projects will continue to fall under non-residential, and that they're under the capacity targets for both upstate and in the Con Edison region. In the Con Edison region, there's a new proposed non-residential block, which will be under a new incentive rate. In the upstate region, there are no proposed changes in the roadmap for the non-residential block. And once those funds are exhausted, those eligible projects, meaning multifamily projects, will need to apply for the commercial and industrial block. And there's another question about in Con Edison, can one project get multiple incentives? In general, projects are eligible for the base megawatt block incentive and one adder on top of that. For example, the multifamily affordable housing adder, the rooftop canopy adder. And so that structure is intended to continue.
This is Luke. I'm taking a couple more questions here. We are not recommending any change to the milestones and the documentation that projects need to have to get into the megawatt block program. So if you're applying for a commercial industrial project under the new design, you would still have the same requirements. You would need to make your 25% deposit, and you would need to have your planning and zoning approvals. It's okay if you make the 100% interconnection payment rather than the 25% payment. That's fine. We're not going to give you a hard time about that. If a project received a megawatt block award already, but did not receive a community adder, can it come in for the new community adder in the new design? No, not in the way that the program is described in the roadmap.
Luke, if we can go back to question 20 and maybe read the question out. I'm not sure if the audience completely understood that. So
Yeah.
Our projects that have paid their full 100% interconnection payment, but did not receive incentive eligible to then receive an incentive, and the answer is yes. If you have not received a New York Sun incentive on any level, even though you've paid your interconnection 25% or 100%, you can apply for a New York Sun incentive, and as long as you haven't received PTO. Is that correct, Liz?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Shyam, you're just piggybacking off of that question. There's a question about the fact that a number of projects have applied for and were approved for the ICSA adder that was introduced last year, but were awarded a $0 incentive. And so that there's a question about whether these projects are proposed to be eligible for the new block. So the short answer is, I think that if you received a New York Sun incentive of any nature, whether it's the ICSA or other incentive, then as per the roadmap, you would not be eligible for the new incentives. But again, this is something that stakeholders are welcome to comment on in their comments, and those comments will be considered and reviewed.
I'll take a couple questions. Can a project receive the base incentive, community adder, prevailing wage adder, and inclusive community solar adder? Yes, yeah, you can. They essentially stack. So if your project is doing all of those things, you can take all of those. And the inclusive community adder is basically has been sized so it sort of fits on top of the community adder. So yes, you can take them all. This here's an interesting question. Is NYSERDA confident that the cost estimates that underpin the roadmap adequately capture the current inflationary environment and its effect on development costs? Great questions. We did the best we could. We did some pretty extensive research and some very extensive modeling. But at the end of the day, I mean, we're projecting costs out through 2030. Not to use the cliche, but we're on the roller coaster. We know costs are increasing, decreasing. Tariffs are going to be, phased in, phased out. We're still not sure what's going to happen with Build It Back Better. So we know. So this is one reason we really like the megawatt block structure, is if costs spike after a few years, or costs decline, we would have the ability to adjust the incentive level of the next block. We're looking at this not as a static program where we set the incentive rate, for the whole, 7-year period all at once and then never touch it again. You notice we're just sort of revealing the first block incentive rates. We don't want to commit to locking in a certain incentive rate, for the whole program length right now, because we know it's either going to be too high, too low, or some combination of the two as items change year by year. We did take into effect, the strong inflation and some of the COVID-related pricing pressures that we saw this past year. So yes, there was a good attempt to account for that inflation, but we are looking at this as a dynamic program design. Next question: how much of that initial 800 megawatt block do you expect to be taken immediately by the existing backlog from the 1-year hiatus? Great question. I would say a very large portion of that 800 megawatt block. We can all take a look and see what has paid at 25% in the utility interconnection queue. I believe it's a little over a gigawatt. Not all of those projects will move ahead. Not all of those projects, will get their permits in a timely manner. So there will be some sort of attrition in that. But we expect that most of that 800 megawatts would be allocated relatively quickly. And I'll pass the mic to my colleagues here.
Luke, it's sorry everyone, it's Shyam again. So just going to take another couple of questions to again give Luke a little bit of break. And we're getting a very high volume of questions and just trying to keep up. So please bear with us. So another question on prevailing wage. Just trying to asking to clarify that the proposed threshold in the roadmap is based on an AC nameplate, but then the New York Sun blocks are thresholds are based on DC nameplates. That is correct. And we recognize that that can be potentially confusing. The reason we went with an AC threshold in the roadmap is because the state level legislation currently regarding prevailing wage thresholds that is currently at 5 megawatts is in AC. And so it is quite possible and likely that to the extent that that threshold be lowered to 1 megawatt, as we do anticipate it possibly happening, it would be staying in AC. So that is why we have also proposed an AC based threshold for prevailing wage to be consistent there. And again, that information would be determined through the interconnection application of that project. And I'll take one more question. Again, relating prevailing wage, where non-CDG projects, question is whether non-CDG projects, so those could be remote crediting projects, as well as on-site behind the meter projects, would they also be subject to the proposed prevailing wage requirements? And so the answer is as proposed in the roadmap. So again, just to remind everyone, this is just a proposal where again, comments are being considered, but as proposed in the roadmap, the answer is yes, regardless of the metering configuration of the project. The proposal is a size-based threshold, again, anticipating a similar blanket size-based threshold coming from state legislation or potentially as part of ITC extension eligibility at the federal level. So even those projects, those non-CDG projects as proposed would also be subject to the proposed prevailing wage requirements.
And Shyam, we had a repeat question on that that was a little different, so I'll just reiterate, yes, that prevailing wage requirement is agnostic as to whether a project is behind the meter, front of the meter, remote credited, or CDG. One question is, can we provide data on the average cost to interconnect per year? Yeah, we've actually got a nice table about that in the roadmap document. You can also go to the utility interconnection queues, download that, and divide through to get the interconnection price per watt for specific projects or averaged over years. So that's a great resource you can use. How many megawatts of community adder will be available? It's 70% of the total megawatts. So let's see. So Johnny, if you could flip back a few slides, please, to where we have the breakdown of the 4 megawatts. Oh, back. Oh, back. Back. We're looking for a chart megawatts that adds up to 4,000. So back up a couple. Oh, stop. There we go. Yeah. So the community adder for Upstate would be 70% of the 2,943. In the community adder budget for Con Ed would be 70% of the 150 for small commercial and 70% of the 150 for the large commercial. Of course, residential projects would not get community adder. We have a couple questions, asking for, deep data analysis. and reports on how many projects are in a certain category. We're happy to follow up with that after the call. We obviously can't provide those numbers on the fly here. The roadmap does not consider a community credit. New York State moved away from the community credit, which of course is essentially paid out by the utilities and baked into their meter tariff. We really wanted to use an upfront incentive where that money is paid out sooner to the developer to help drive down the project costs. I know there are pros and cons to upfront incentive versus ongoing based incentive. Some of that's discussed in the roadmap, but the roadmap does not consider, moving back to community credit or MTC.
Hey, Luke.
Yes, sir.
This is Warren Myers from the Department of Public Service. If I could just add one thing to that.
Please do.
So the community credit was a temporary transition measure. If you go back to the original 2017 order, the commission did a thoughtful balancing of how much individual utility ratepayers should pay versus all ratepayers of the state collectively pay, which is can be argued to be a more equitable way to finance the statewide goal now at 10 gigawatts. And so if we were to shift back to the community credit approach, for example, just to pick an example, for Con Ed to fund certain projects or the carve out we have for Con Ed, that would tip the balance and make it go back to the way it was, where certain utilities, ratepayers were paying a disproportionate share of the statewide policy. But as Luke has pointed out a number of times, this is just our proposal for how to balance the equity of sharing the cost across the state with the desire to carve out certain monies for, say, projects to be developed down in New York City. And if you think the commission should adopt a different balancing, that is have Con Ed ratepayers pay a bigger share through a community credit approach as opposed to this approach, please put it in your comments, because the way you're going to affect what gets done now is by commenting to the commission and getting them to modify what we have proposed.
Luke, it's David. We've got about, looks like 7 minutes to go with dozens of questions that are unanswered at this point. Is it possible we can send a QA out, FAQ out to all the attendees after this presentation?
Yeah, David, that's a fine idea. This is more questions than we anticipated. I think what we can do is get to the questions we didn't get and maybe consolidate some of the overlapping questions and send out a kind of a curated list of responses. I think that's very doable.
Okay.
Luke, I was just going to agree. I think we can do something after both webinars. We'll compile the questions and send out a Q&A that kind of addresses the common questions from both webinars.
So one
That's
common
great.
question I'm seeing that I thought we could clarify here is just the sort of process flow at a high level from here on, with regard to where we go from here once the roadmap has been filed. And so I'll take a stab at that. So at this point, we are still in the comment period, which is open through, I believe, the 7th of March. And following that, the comments will be reviewed towards a commission order. So realistically, wouldn't expect that at the March session. So we'd be looking at April or further on from there. And that commission ruling would, assuming that the roadmap is either approved or approved modifications, which is still subject to the commission itself. NYSERDA would then issue an operating plan with some more specifics around incentive levels that were not provided in the roadmap. And so that tends to be fleshed out quite quickly in the matter of a few weeks, just based on history following a commission order. And following that, the incentives would be expected to hit the street very soon after that. So if there's any additional clarity that David, you or Luke want to provide there, please do so.
I think you said it well.
Luke, with the 5 minutes, are there any other questions that are being asked consistently? I mean, I think the one question of if you've already applied for a New York Sun incentive of any nature, can you reapply for a new base incentive? And the answer is no, right, Luke? You cannot at this point. If you have thoughts about that, you can respond with comments in the roadmap.
Correct. And there were a couple of questions that were not really questions, but were more, thoughtful suggestions or comments. That's the exact kind of thing you should be filing as comments. As a clarifying point, in the roadmap, we're not proposing any changes to VETR. I know in the technical conference, there was a lot of discussion about potentially changing the E-value. The roadmap essentially recommends that the current E-value of 3.103 cents per kilowatt hour just be fixed for multiple years, but we are not proposing any other changes to VETR in terms of DRV or introducing any new value stack items. We received many questions about what the second upstate block would be once the initial 800 megawatts at 17 cents is fully allocated. We don't have a value assigned yet to a potential second block. But that is a great question, given that first 800 megawatts could go relatively quickly.
Yeah, I would say that's in keeping with the latest activity we had in the commercial industrial rest of state megawatt block, where we had a certain amount of blocks, I think it was 10 or so, and then we would just do one at a time to see where the market was moving. There's so many variables that change outside of our control. So to have a pre-assigned incentive value for a second block when the first block might move quickly, we're not sure, maybe isn't in the best interest of the industry. So we decided to do it in the nature that we have been doing it recently, giving the industry a fair amount of notice of what that incentive might be and how much capacity we're talking about.
Since we have just 2 minutes left, I'll just quickly want to respond to another question about prevailing wage. There's been a couple of actually more comments and questions about the proposed cutoff date as the date of the filing for requiring prevailing wage as a programmatic requirement, and arguing that it is difficult for developers to make these decisions based on land lease payments and engineering studies prior to interconnection. So I take that point, speaking for myself, and this is prevailing wage in particular is definitely an area where we are very interested in seeing comments from stakeholders, and we would certainly be reviewing those very closely, whether it's the threshold date, whether it's the megawatt thresholds, whether it's the specific added levels proposed. So I would encourage you to either file comments yourself as a party or work with your relevant trade association if you're an industry participant to include those, because we are very interested in seeing comments of that nature.
Thank you, Shyam. Well, we're at 12 o'clock, and so we're at time. And the next few steps for NYSERDA will be holding the webinar on Thursday, posting the recordings to the website once those are available, and sending that list of Q&A answers that we have typed up out to all attendees, and we may post that on the website as well. So let's wrap it up. I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'd like to thank all my colleagues for helping with the Q&A. And I'd like to thank all the attendees for all of the thoughtful questions and suggestions. Thank you very much, and have a great day.